Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that the price of literally everything you produce just dropped by 50%,
Yeah.
like globally, overnight.
Oh man, yeah, just total financial ruin.
Exactly. You are completely ruined. But, and here's the crazy part, across the ocean, some completely different nation is using your exact financial ruin to, well, to basically build an empire.
It's wild to think about, but yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Right. So today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most intense global economic earthquakes in modern history. And spoiler alert, no, it is not the Great Depression of the 1930s. We
Yeah.
are actually looking at the Great Depression of 1873 to 1896.
Which is, I mean, it's such a fascinating era because it really provides this ultimate test of how societies function under pressure. You have to picture a world that's just undergoing this massive, sudden, and honestly violent technological shock.
Like a total rewiring of the world.
Exactly. We are talking about the sudden rollout of mechanical reapers on farms, totally new chemical fertilizers, and vastly improved drainage systems. And then, you combine that with these revolutionary leaps in transportation.
Right, the trains and the boats.
Yeah. Massive continental rail networks that are just pushing deep into the interiors of continents for the first time. Plus these motorized steamships that are suddenly crossing oceans in absolute record time. And, even the very early days of commercial refrigeration.
So suddenly all those old geographic barriers, they just vanished. I mean, you had these vast, totally untapped plains in the United States and Canada, Russia, Argentina, and almost overnight they become the absolute low-cost producers of the entire world's food.
Yeah, they were just pumping out cheap grain, loading it onto those new steamships, and absolutely flooding the global market.
And the result is just a total catastrophic crash in global agricultural prices. I mean, the farming populations of Western and Central Europe basically woke up one morning to find themselves entirely uncompetitive.
It was sheer panic. And, to understand the scale of it, you can kind of think of it like a giant chemistry
I
experiment.
like that.
How so?
Well, this massive drop in grain prices is, it's like a highly reactive chemical reagent, right? And we are basically going to drop that exact same chemical into 4 different societal test tubes.
Okay, got it.
So we're looking at Germany, France, Britain, and the United States. We're diving into this genuinely brilliant comparative study by Peter Alexis Gourevitch, and he examines how these 4 major powers reacted to the exact same crisis in wildly different ways, and, what those reactions actually reveal about the hidden mechanics of power.
What I love about this deep dive for you listening is that we aren't just looking at like a dusty timeline of historical events. We're actually looking at the underlying architecture of human behavior.
Absolutely.
Because you can analyze really any national crisis through a few specific lenses. The source material outlines 4 of them. First, there's the economic lens, which is basically the raw fight for survival among different interest groups, like who is losing money.
Right, the wallet lens.
Exactly. Then there's the political system lens. This is about the actual structure of government, who holds the levers of power, democracies versus authoritarian regimes.
Right.
Third is the international system lens. So looking at national security and foreign policy pressures, like do we need to protect our farms so we don't starve during a war? And finally, the 4th lens is economic ideology. Basically, what are the deep-seated cultural beliefs of that specific nation?
That's a great summary of the framework.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's kind of like, well, it's like watching 4 different friends lose their jobs at the exact same time, right?
Exactly.
One friend reacts based purely on how much is in their savings account. That's the economic lens. Another reacts based on like their family structure, the political lens. The third reacts based on some weird rivalry with their neighbor, the international lens. And the 4th reacts based on their personal life philosophy, the ideology lens.
That is a perfect analogy. And rather than just, listing these concepts out abstractly, we're going to actually watch them collide in real time.
Right. Let's get into the actual history. Let's start with Germany, which at this point in the late 19th century is a full-blown authoritarian empire.
It is, and the German landscape at the time was totally dominated by this group known as the Junkers.
The Junkers, right.
Yeah, these were incredibly aristocratic, deeply conservative estate owners, and their lands were mostly concentrated east of the Elbe River. So when this massive flood of cheap foreign grain hit, their entire wealth, their whole way of life was on the verge of being eradicated.
Just wiped out.
Completely. So their immediate visceral response was was to demand this massive wall of tariffs, heavy taxes on imported goods, just to artificially keep the domestic price of grain high so they could survive.
But, and this is what I found so interesting in the source text, they totally had other options. The author points out they could have just modernized, like the Danish did next door.
Ah, yes, the Danish pivot. Right. Denmark watched all this cheap grain wash over their shores, and they just said, hey, cheap animal feed. And they shifted their whole agricultural economy away from growing grain toward producing high-quality dairy and meat.
Yep, they adapted.
So why didn't the Junkers just pivot to butter and bacon? Like, why the panic?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. It's because of the social mechanics required to actually make that pivot.
What do you mean?
So to shift a massive farm to dairy and meat production, you really need small, manageable farm units. You need owner-managers physically on the ground, and you need highly skilled, high-quality labor to manage livestock properly. You can't just have untrained people doing it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and the Junkers, they held all their immense political power specifically by controlling these massive, sprawling estates that were worked by entirely landless, unskilled, and frankly, politically suppressed laborers.
Ah, okay. So modernizing the farm actually meant dismantling their own social hierarchy. They didn't just want to, save their bank accounts. They basically wanted to protect their status as the masters of the universe.
That is a perfect way to frame it. They needed the old system to survive, but the Junkers had this one fundamental problem. Even with all their aristocratic clout, they just did not have enough leverage to force a high tariff through on their own.
They didn't have the numbers.
Exactly. They urgently needed an alliance. And it just so happened that heavy industry in Germany, we're talking the iron, steel, and coal magnates, they were also really feeling the pain of foreign competition and deflation.
Oh, so they were bleeding money too.
Yes, they desperately wanted protection too.
Okay, so this is where Chancellor Otto von Bismarck steps in, right? He builds a bridge between them. He orchestrates what becomes famously known as the marriage of iron and rye. But wait, break down the actual mechanics of this for me. How do you fuse two completely totally unrelated economic sectors together like that? Well, he does it through this classic political mechanism called log rolling.
Log rolling, okay.
Yeah, it is essentially just a transactional vote trading alliance. Bismarck basically gets the agricultural elites to vote for industrial protection, and in return, the industrial elites vote for agricultural protection.
Wow, okay.
I mean, neither side particularly wants to pay higher prices for the other guy's goods, right? But they both realize it is literally the only mathematical way to get the protection they desperately need for themselves.
It's basically, I'll vote for your expensive steel if you vote for my expensive wheat.
Precisely. And Bismarck's real genius, or, his ruthlessness, depending on how you look at it, was how he weaponized this log rolling deal. He didn't just do it to stabilize the economy. He used this specific economic coalition as a pressure cooker to permanently seal the authoritarian system in place.
Wait, how does a tariff do that?
By giving both of these massive, powerful centers exactly what they wanted, he secured long-term tariff revenue for his military apparatus. And maybe more importantly, he successfully isolated his political enemies.
Who were his enemies at the time?
Primarily the pro-democracy liberals and the rising socialist movements. They were totally shut out of this new mega coalition.
And he also, wrapped the whole thing in the flag, didn't he? He used that international lens we talked about to his advantage. He claimed that protecting agriculture and steel was this vital matter of national security and imperial strength.
Oh, absolutely.
So it made it seem practically treasonous to oppose the tariffs.
He did. He brilliantly masked what was basically a domestic class war as a defense against foreign enemies.
That is wild. Okay, so that is the authoritarian pressure cooker. But let's look at the open beaker right next door. Over in France, you have a completely different political architecture.
Right, very different.
France had universal male suffrage at this time. They were a republic. No Bismarck, no emperor pulling all the strings from behind a curtain. Yet they ended up passing the Malines Tariff of 1892, which, if I'm reading this right, was essentially the exact same high tariff wall on agriculture and industry that Germany built.
It was. It was almost identical in its economic effect. Now, the French landscape was totally devoid of those massive aristocratic Junker estates. French society was packed with small property owners, independent peasants, and much smaller scale manufacturers.
They're more decentralized.
Yeah, but they were facing the exact same economic devastation from those plunging global prices. So, because France was a democracy, the mechanics of actually achieving a tariff were totally grassroots rather than top-down.
They just voted for it.
Exactly. Through completely normal democratic legislative maneuvering, you had these completely fractured political parties. I mean, royalists who absolutely hated Republicans, clericals who despised secularists, but these small producers realized something crucial.
That they were all going broke.
Right. They realized their shared economic bleeding was way more important than their ideological differences. So they just naturally banded together, forming these massive cross-party majorities in the legislature to protect their livelihoods.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me, and I want to push back a little bit on the lenses here.
Sure, go for it.
If an authoritarian empire and a democratic republic both land on the exact same high tariff policy outcome, does the political system actually even matter? Like, it sounds to me like raw economics is just completely in the driver's seat here. The people losing money will always find a way to stop the bleeding, regardless of the voting system they live under.
That is a fantastic point, and Gourevitch addresses this tension really deeply in the study. You are totally right that the underlying economic dynamic was identical in both places. The producers successfully out-organized the consumers.
Right.
Heavy industrialists were just much better organized than the makers of finished goods. Large property owners were way better organized than urban laborers. The economic incentives for survival were just so intense that the producers won, period.
Right, money talks.
But, and this is the key, the political system absolutely mattered for how they won. In Germany, it required this shady backroom bargain orchestrated by an autocrat. In France, it required massive public coalition building and mass electoral appeal. So, economics provides the motive, but the political system provides the rules of engagement.
Ah, I love that. Economics is the motive. Politics is the rules of engagement. Okay, so on the European continent, protectionism basically becomes the default survival strategy. But let's cross the English Channel now, because the British watch this exact same flood of cheap grain wash over their shores, and, well, they do something completely different.
They throw the gates open even wider.
Exactly. Great Britain chose the exact opposite path. Low tariffs on both industry and agriculture. A total unwavering commitment to free trade. Why?
Well, Britain's industrial advantage is really the starting point here. They were the very first nation to industrialize, so their manufacturing base was already highly developed, heavily capitalized, and utterly dominant on the global stage.
They were already winning the game.
Exactly. They actively wanted free trade because it meant they could export their manufactured goods everywhere without facing retaliatory tariffs. And furthermore, British industrialists actually loved cheap imported grain.
Really? Why?
Because cheap bread meant they could pay their factory workers lower wages without starving them, which kept their corporate profit margins massive.
Okay, that totally explains the factory owners. I get that. But what about the British aristocracy? The people who actually owned the agricultural land. I mean, they were losing money on grain just like the German junkers and the French peasants were.
Right, they were, yes.
So why weren't the British elites screaming for a massive tariff wall?
This is where we really see the power of foresight and, honestly, just having a ton of capital. The British aristocrats did not demand protection because they had spent the previous few decades heavily diversifying their wealth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were not just landlords anymore. They were already deeply embedded in the Industrial Revolution themselves. They had funneled their agricultural profits into coal mining, into the new rail networks, and into incredibly lucrative overseas imperial trade.
Wow.
They had even socially integrated by intermarrying with the rising industrial bourgeoisie.
So they operated kind of like 19th century venture capitalists.
Basically, yes.
Because they didn't have all their net worth tied up in the price of wheat, a crash in the wheat market wasn't an existential threat to them. I mean, they could afford to take the hit on the farm because their factory and their railroad stocks were absolutely booming.
Exactly. And even on the farms they still operated, they possessed the capital to do exactly what the Germans refused to do.
Modernize. Danish.
Right. They shifted away from growing unprofitable grain and transitioned into high-value foodstuffs. They raised livestock for meat and dairy. And you have to remember, those are products that couldn't easily survive a transatlantic steamship journey without spoiling back then.
So they didn't have the foreign competition for milk and fresh meat.
Exactly. And what do you think they fed those lucrative dairy cows and pigs?
The dirt cheap imported grain.
Yes. They turned a global crisis into a cheap input for a brand new business model.
That is just brilliant. But there's another layer here, right? Because the source material talks about this ideological ghost haunting Britain at the time.
Yes, the ideological lens. This goes back to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846.
What were those?
They were old agricultural tariffs. Basically, decades before this new global depression even started, Britain had already fought a massive, bitter, society-wide war over agricultural tariffs, and the free traders won.
Ah, so the debate was already settled.
More than settled. That victory became foundational to British identity. Free trade wasn't just viewed as an economic policy anymore, it was elevated to a quasi-religion.
Wow.
It was entirely synonymous with liberty, progress, and the prosperity of the working man. So to demand a tariff in 1880s, Britain was viewed not just as bad economics, but as politically backward and, frankly, morally suspect.
Okay, so Britain had the diversified wealth and the cultural ideology to just ride out the storm. But now we have to look at the most combustible reaction of all four. We've seen countries importing all this cheap food, but what happens in the country that is actually growing and exporting that cheap food while simultaneously trying to build a massive industrial sector of its own?
Right, it's a totally unique position.
Yeah, let's cross the Atlantic to the United States.
The United States is this fascinating hybrid in this story. They ultimately end up with high industrial tariffs, kind of like Germany, but low agricultural tariffs, kind of like Britain. And to understand the mechanics of this, you really have to look at the brutal, awful reality facing the American farmer at this time.
Okay, I really need you to break this down for me, because on paper it makes absolutely no sense.
Okay.
The American farmers on the Great Plains were, at that time, the most efficient producers on the planet. They were the ones flooding the world with grain. So why were they so miserable?
Because they were trapped in a vicious, unbreakable cycle of overproduction and deflation. The mechanics of 19th century deflation are absolutely critical to understand here. The U.S. government was moving toward the gold standard, which meant the national money supply was very tight and restricted.
Okay, not a lot of cash going around.
Right. But at the exact same time, because the farmers were using all those amazing new reapers and chemical fertilizers, they were producing record-breaking yields of crops.
Supply is going up.
Way up. And when you have a tight money supply and a massive explosion of goods, the price of those goods absolutely plummets.
Oh, man. So their efficiency was actually their doom.
Precisely. Because their debts were fixed. Think about it. To buy that fancy new mechanical reaper, a farmer had to borrow money from Eastern banks. But if the price of wheat suddenly drops by half, that farmer now has to grow and harvest twice as much wheat just to make the exact same monthly mortgage payment.
They were just running on a treadmill that kept speeding up.
Yeah, it was exhausting. And to make matters worse, they were completely at the mercy of the railroad monopolies.
Oh, right, because they had to ship the grain east.
Exactly. The railroads owned the only route to get that grain to market, so they could, and did, charge totally extortionate freight rates.
So the farmers were just getting squeezed to death by the banks on one side and the railroads on the other.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads to this massive populist uprising, culminating in the U.S. election of 1896. This is the moment the American test tube nearly explodes. You have William Jennings Bryan leading the Democratic Party, and he's acting as the champion of this massive low-tariff alliance of farmers, debtors, and the rural South and West.
Right.
And fighting him is William McKinley, representing the high-tariff, pro-industry Republican establishment.
It was a fundamental clash over the entire architecture of the American economy. Bryan was fighting for inflation specifically. He wanted to start minting silver to rapidly expand the money supply and relieve the farmers' crushing debts. He famously delivered the Cross of Gold speech, just aggressively attacking the Eastern banking establishment.
Right, and McKinley.
McKinley and the industrialists wanted high tariffs to protect their growing factories from European competition, and they desperately wanted to keep the gold standard to protect the value of the loans they had issued to everyone else.
Wait, let me stop you there.
Mm-hmm.
If the farmers were the ones providing incredibly cheap food to the cities, wouldn't the urban factory workers naturally side with Bryan? Like, the guy working in a steel mill in Pennsylvania wants a cheap loaf of bread. He doesn't want McKinley's high tariffs, which might trigger retaliatory taxes and hurt the whole economy, right?
You would think so, yes, and that was exactly Bryan's hope. But this is where the tactical warfare of the 1896 election was really decided. McKinley and the Republican political machine were tactically brilliant.
What'd they do?
They managed to convince the urban industrial worker that Bryan's plan to inflate the currency and help the farmer would actually destroy the purchasing power of the factory worker's weekly wage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, McKinley framed it as the stark choice between a stable industrial paycheck or totally wild economic anarchy. He basically told the factory workers, look, Brian wants to devalue your wages and wreck the factories you work in just to save himself.
And from what I read, Brian kind of handed them the ammunition to do that, didn't he? His populist rhetoric was deeply steeped in this rural evangelical fundamentalism. I mean, he sounded like a prairie preacher.
He really did.
It electrified the plains, sure, but if you were, say, a Catholic immigrant working in a New York factory, Brian sounded entirely alien to you. He just didn't speak the language of the modern urbanizing nation.
Exactly. He alienated the very urban centers he desperately needed to win. But, there is an even deeper structural reason for the outcome, and it ties directly back to that political system lens we talked about earlier. The industrialists possessed this massive, almost unbeatable structural advantage because of the long shadow of the Civil War.
Wait, how does a war that ended 30 years earlier dictate a tariff election in 1896?
Because the Civil War physically and politically shattered the traditional agrarian power base in the United States, which was the South. For the entire first half of the 19th century, Southern planters basically dominated American politics, and they aggressively kept tariffs low.
Because they were exporting cotton.
Exactly. But the Civil War removed them from power and permanently fused the financial interests of the Northeast with the rapidly growing industrial power of the Midwest. That created an almost unbeatable pro-business Republican coalition. So the political machinery was heavily tilted in favor of industry long before Brian ever even gave a speech.
So 1896 wasn't just a debate over monetary policy or import taxes. It sounds like it was a battle for the soul of the United States, and industry permanently won.
It did. It locked in the absolute dominance of industrial capitalism. The farmers waged a monumental fight, but from 1896 onward, agriculture was permanently relegated to the back seat of American political power.
Okay, so bringing all of this together now, we have looked at these four massive historical reactions. We have seen the raw economic fight for survival, the political structures that channeled that fight, the international pressures, the ideological traditions. When Gourevitch synthesizes this whole era at the end of the study, how does he actually weigh these different forces? Which one wins out?
Well, he concludes that the economic lens, different groups fighting desperately for their material survival is definitely the strongest foundational base. In every single country we looked at, you can trace the initial motivations back to exactly who is losing money.
Right. Follow the money.
Always.
Yeah.
However, the economic lens is entirely insufficient on its own. You urgently need the political system lens to understand how those panicked economic groups organize, who they are forced to form alliances with, and the specific mechanisms they use to get what they want.
Like the log rolling in Germany versus the mass voting in France.
Exactly. How they translate their desires into the actual law of the land depends on the political system. The international and ideological losses add vital, fascinating context. But the real bedrock of history here is economics filtered through political structures.
And this leads to what I thought was the ultimate revelation, like the plot twist of the entire study.
Oh, yeah.
We set this whole conversation, looking at how these different political systems reacted to an economic crisis and how they shaped their tariff policies.
Yeah.
But Gourevitch basically flips the camera around at the end.
Yeah.
He argues that the reverse is actually true. The policies forged the regimes.
Yes. This is such a profound takeaway. The choices these countries made just to survive the 1870s literally etched the political bedrock of the entire 20th century.
How so?
Well, think about Germany. By choosing high tariffs and forging that marriage of iron and rye, Germany didn't just fix a temporary trade deficit, they entrenched a deeply militaristic, authoritarian alliance between conservative aristocrats and heavy industry. And that specific economic coalition paved the direct, disastrous road to the world wars.
Oh, wow.
And in France, by throwing up the million tariff to protect all those small farmers, they economically saved the conservative rural classes. And by saving them financially, they pacified them politically, which literally stopped them from revolting and saved the democratic French Republic from collapsing back into a monarchy.
Exactly. And in the U.S., the tariff and currency battles of 1896 cemented the unchallenged, absolute dominance of industrial capitalism. It cemented the architecture for the entire American century that followed. The crisis forced a choice, and that choice reshaped their national identities permanently.
It is genuinely staggering to realize that a sudden drop in the global price of wheat can completely rewrite the political DNA of the entire world. It all just depends on who wins the internal fight for survival when the ground starts shaking.
It just proves that our political structures are incredibly fragile and highly malleable in the face of massive technological and economic change. Which, brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. If a drop in grain prices in the 1870s was enough to forge the alliances and the empires that define the political map of the 20th century, well, just think about the massive global economic shifts we are living through right now.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, from the explosion of artificial intelligence threatening millions of knowledge workers to the intensely disruptive transition away from fossil fuels toward green energy, these are our cheap grain moments. The pressure cookers are heating up again. So who are the junkers and the industrialists fighting for survival today? And what new political regimes are being etched into our future right this very second?